It's October 3rd of 1979. Two members of the Swabian Everest Expedition, 39-year-old German climber Hannelore and her guide Sungdore Sherpa, are stranded in the death zone of Everest, fighting for survival through the entire night. It's been hours of relentless exposure, and the conditions are progressively getting worse. One of their American teammates had already succumbed to hypothermia just a few hours earlier, and now it's Hannelore's body that's losing its battle against the tallest mountain in the world. The day before, around 1 p.m., she and her team had successfully reached the summit, marking a monumental achievement for the expedition, which was making its second summit in just a few days. 2 days ago, the expedition leader and Hannelore's husband, Gerard Schmatz, had also made it to the top and returned safely, earning the title of being the oldest climber to summit Everest at the age of 50. This time, it was Hannelore's turn to make history. She set out to become the fourth woman ever to reach the peak. However, what she could have never imagined was that her name would be remembered in history for a much darker reason. She'd become the first woman to die on the mountain. What's even more disturbing is that her tragic, desperate attempt to conquer the mountain would practically become a creepy reminder for every climber heading up that Everest is not to be underestimated. Hannelore and Gerard were staying in Kathmandu in May of 1973 after successfully summiting the 8th highest peak in the world, Manaslu, when they first applied to the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism for permission to climb Everest. But with too many influential groups vying for a shot at the mountain, they ended up on a long waiting list of hopeful contenders. As they waited, the couple spent the next few years tackling some of the highest peaks, sharpening their skills, and gaining invaluable high-altitude mountaineering experience. By 1977, they found themselves back in Kathmandu, this time after conquering the world's 4th highest mountain, Lhotse. Around this time, they finally got the news that they had been waiting for. They could attempt Everest during the post-monsoon season of 1979. While a 2-year window to plan and execute an entire expedition might seem like plenty of time, it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. They were funding the expedition privately without any backing from an alpine organization or government agency. This meant that all the equipment, food, and other necessities for the entire expedition, including the members and the Sherpas they planned to hire, had to be purchased and shipped from Europe to Nepal because it wasn't possible to get what they needed in Kathmandu. Getting all that gear together was already a massive challenge, but the real task was packing, managing, and shipping tons of materials all the way to Nepal under tight supervision. Hannelore became the driving force behind making it all happen. While Gerard focused on the technical planning as the expedition leader, Hannelore wrote countless letters to gather all the necessary supplies. Then, with the help of a small team, she packed the tons of equipment into 30-kilogram loads so the porters could carry them easily, and shipped everything to Kathmandu. By July of 1979, everything was all set up for the expedition to begin. In addition to Gerard and Hannelore, there were 6 more members on the team. Among them was the skilled American climber Ray Jeanette. Hannelore and Gerard had met Ray in 1978 when they climbed Mount McKinley. Also known as Denali, it is the highest peak in North America and is considered the coldest mountain on the planet. Ray lived in a small town at the foot of Denali and was the first guide to the mountain. He had successfully reached the summit of Denali over 35 times. Gerard and Hannelore quickly connected with his impressive profile and invited him to join the expedition. Ray brought a lot of experience in surviving harsh, cold climates and was also an expert in bivouacking. Bivouacking is the practice of setting up a temporary camp or shelter, often in the open, without the use of a tent. This is a crucial skill in high-risk climbs, where anything can go wrong at any time. This was especially important because the expedition was set to face some of the worst weather conditions in early October. Initially, Gerard planned to avoid the bad weather by starting early during the rainy season instead of waiting for the monsoon rains to stop, which was the standard practice. Gerard wanted to set up the base camp by mid-August, but when he arrived in Nepal, the ministry informed them that they couldn't leave Kathmandu until August 10th at the earliest and couldn't set up base camp before September 1st either. After some tough negotiations, the team finally got the green light to start their 250-kilometer pre-hike on July 31st. Normally, this trek takes around 20 days, but since they couldn't officially set foot on Everest until September 1st, they had a whole month to get it done. On the bright side, that gave them plenty of time to adjust to the altitude, but it wasn't nearly enough to make up for the delays they'd already faced. While the rains had cleared by now, they were still walking straight into the bad weather expected from late September until early October. and that's exactly where things started to go downhill. On September 24th of 1979, the team set up their final camp at South Col, at an altitude of about 7,986 meters. From here, they were supposed to make their summit push in 3 groups. Hannelore had originally planned to stop at South Col, but since she had shown incredible strength throughout the expedition, she decided to attempt the summit as well. However, to keep things safe and avoid putting the whole team at risk, she opted for a solo bid with just 2 Sherpas, making sure no one else's success would hinge on her decision. Everything seemed in place, and it was time to move forward, but then, all of a sudden, a relentless snowstorm swallowed the mountain, burying it in a whiteout that would drag on for days. With no other option, the entire expedition retreated to base camp. Once the storm finally passed, they regrouped and planned a new push. To move faster this time, they split into 2 teams instead of 3, aiming for back-to-back summit attempts. Since their bodies were already acclimated, they skipped the usual long breaks for altitude adjustment. The first team, led by Gerard, consisted of 2 climbers and 2 Sherpas. On September 28th, the 5-member group set out, and after 3 grueling days of climbing, they reached South Col once again. On October 1st of 1979, around 2 p.m., Gerard's team stood victorious at the summit. They radioed back the incredible news to the rest of the expedition. By then, the second team, including 5 climbers and the support staff, had arrived at South Col, eagerly awaiting their turn. Leading the way back, Gerard reached the camp around 7 p.m. the same day. The first big milestone was officially behind them, and now it was the second group's turn to go for the summit. While the camp buzzed with energy and optimism, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with Gerard. His mind kept drifting back to Hannelore's decision to attempt the summit. With weather conditions hinting at trouble too, he tried talking Hannelore out of it, urging her to reconsider. But she wasn't having it. When Gerard persisted, she started to get annoyed, and after a few more failed attempts to change her mind, everyone crawled into their tents for some much-needed rest. At around 5 a.m. the next morning, Group 2 set off from the camp, aiming for the summit. Since this was a slightly larger unit, they split into 3 rope teams. The first team had 1 climber and 1 Sherpa. The second included 3 climbers, one of whom was American mountaineer Ray Jeanette, and the third one had Hannelore roped to 2 Sherpas, Ang Jungbu and Sundare. The ascent started off smoothly, and the weather held up well, but as they climbed higher, storm clouds thickened, and the conditions kept getting worse. By the time they neared the summit, it was obvious they were in for trouble. Ray, tied to 2 other climbers, became unhappy with their pace. He unroped himself from the group and made a solo dash for the summit. After nearly 13 hours of hiking through the death zone, Group 2 finally stepped onto the summit. The death zone refers to areas above 8,000 meters where the conditions are often too harsh for an average human to survive without supplemental oxygen. Once that supply runs out, your body starts breaking down. High altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema set in rapidly, and staying exposed for more than 16 to 20 hours can be deadly. Now throw in worsening weather, and it's like sitting in a death trap where every second drains you dry, and you may not even realize how far you've gone until it's too late. By 6 p.m. that day, Gerard and his team, who had already descended 2,000 meters below the death zone, received word that Hannelore and her group had successfully reached the top. But with the storm raging on, they didn't stay long and immediately began their descent. Unfortunately, that didn't go as planned. The first 2 rope teams kept their original formations, but Ray, who made it down the climb solo on the way up, joined Hannelore's 3rd rope team for the journey down. After about 300 meters of grueling downhill trekking, they made it to an elevation of 8,500 meters. That's when Ray made a fatal realization. His oxygen tank was almost empty. While the rest of the team pressed on, Ray refused to continue and decided to bivouac for the night. Hannelore, completely exhausted too, chose to stay with him. The Sherpas literally begged them not to stop, but Ray was sure his bivouacking experience would get them through the night. What he didn't know was that he was showing signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, and in this condition, the brain swells from prolonged exposure to extreme altitude and lack of oxygen. It clouds judgment and gives climbers a false sense of security, making them feel safe and confident when the reality is exactly the opposite. When they refused to budge, Sherpa Sangdara decided to stay with the duo through the night. As darkness fell, Ray decided to build a snow cave, but the snow was too soft to hold. They remained exposed to the brutal, bone-chilling winds that only grew stronger as the night dragged on. By morning, Ray's body had given out, and he died in that makeshift shelter. That's when panic set in for Hannelore and Sundare. With no other choice, they continued. But just 200 meters farther, overwhelmed with exhaustion, Hannelore sat down and leaned against her backpack. Her final words were a desperate plea for water before hypothermia claimed her at 8,300 meters. Back at camp, when Gerard had learned that Ray and Hannelore had stayed to bivouac, he immediately sent 2 Sherpas up to help. By the time they arrived, only Sundar was alive, barely holding on, suffering from severe frostbite and exhaustion. He was rushed down to the medical care, where he eventually lost most of his fingers and toes. The Swabian Everest Expedition was a groundbreaking success on paper. It was the smallest team at the time to reach the summit, and did so in a record period of just 32 days, even with a full retreat to base camp along the way. Every member of the team reached the top, including Hannelore, who became the first German and only the 4th woman in the world to summit Everest. At the age of 50, Gerard was the oldest climber to summit Everest at the time, and he and Hannelore were the first married couple to do it together. However, despite all of that success, the milestone they're most remembered for is that Hannelore was the first woman to lose her life while climbing Everest. For years, her body lay on the southern slopes of the mountain, leaning up against her backpack, just like it was in her final moments. A number of climbing parties tried to recover her body over the years, and some even lost their own lives in the process. But it wasn't until 1985 when the fierce winds and heavy snow finally sent her down into the lower reaches, where she vanished into the snow. To this day, no one's been able to find or recover what remains of her on Mount Everest. Nobukazu Kuriki was just a regular high school kid when he found himself drawn to a peculiar interest, the thrill of being in the spotlight. His friends recalled how he always jumped at the chance to be in school plays, aiming for the biggest roles and soaking up the attention as the kid everyone was talking about. For most people, this might have been just a passing phase, the kind of fleeting enthusiasm that comes and goes with age, but for Nobukazu, that hunger for attention didn't go anywhere. It clung to him, quietly shaping a future no one saw coming. He'd go on to become one of the most controversial climbers Japan has ever known. After finishing high school, Nobukazu tried his hand at becoming a comedian, but it didn't take long for him to realize he wasn't getting much of a positive reception. So he changed course and enrolled in university in 2001. In his downtime, he took up mountain climbing in Japan, inspired by a shared interest with some girl he was seeing at the time. That ended up becoming his permanent hobby, and it took him just a couple of years to summit Denali, the tallest mountain in North America. That success set him on a new path, and now he was determined to conquer all of the 7 summits of the world. The 7 summits refer to the highest peaks on each traditional continent. With Denali already conquered, Nobukazu set out to tackle the remaining 6 over the next couple of years. In 2005, he climbed the tallest mountain in South America, Aconcagua, Mount Elbrus in Europe, and Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. In 2006, he added Karsten's Pyramid to his list, which was the tallest mountain in the Australian Pacific region. By 2007, he had scaled 6 of the 7, adding Antarctica's Vincent Massif to his growing list of triumphs. The only one left now was the ultimate challenge, the highest peak in Asia and also in the world, Mount Everest. Around this time, he also managed to summit some of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, which really boosted his fame in the Japanese media. He often streamed his climbs and posted videos of his summits, which really put him in the spotlight. That same year, after he climbed Antarctica's Vincent Massif, a TV channel even made a documentary about him. His fan base exploded, and he started cashing in on those numbers, asking for donations to fund his international expeditions and signing tons of sponsorship deals. But with all this media frenzy, seasoned mountaineers couldn't ignore the fact that the way he portrayed himself to such a large, mostly inexperienced audience was highly overblown. He claimed to have done all of his climbs without supplemental oxygen and in a solo alpine style, basically doing everything on his own without porters, Sherpas, or their set routes. But witnesses who saw his climbs firsthand reported that he actually used ropes and ladders set up by Sherpas multiple times and hired porters to carry his gear on different expeditions. As for oxygen, supplemental oxygen is usually needed at higher elevations where the oxygen percentage in the air drops. This can vary depending on the individual's ability, but the National Institute of Health suggests an average of 6,500 meters where climbers might need supplemental oxygen. However, for an experienced climber, like Nobukazu claimed, the real threshold should have only been above 7,000 meters. Some expert climbers even need supplemental oxygen only in the death zones. Nobukazu claimed all 6 out of the 7 summits he climbed were done without supplemental oxygen, but in reality none of the 6 peaks he climbed were even over 7,000 meters. In fact, 5 of them were much below 6,500 meters. So while he said he didn't use supplemental oxygen, there wasn't much needed for it on those climbs anyway. Some of his fans argue that he also climbed a few 8,000 meter peaks, which might have been without oxygen, staying true to his claim. But there were also reports from witnesses saying he secretly used oxygen on those expeditions. On top of that, Nobukazu never fully clarified the details of his claim and even insisted it applied to all his climbs, which pretty much proves he was exaggerating the scale of his expeditions. Whatever the case may have been, the critics weren't loud enough to hurt Nobukazu's image, so he didn't bother addressing them. But then Everest became the one nightmare he couldn't outrun, and in his relentless pursuit, he only ended up exposing himself more and more over the years. In September of 2009, he announced his plan to conquer his final 7th summit, Mount Everest. He widely publicized his expedition, gaining plenty of sponsors, but when he finally set foot on the mountain, he couldn't get past the 8,000 meter mark and fell sick due to the altitude. This was the first failure of his mountaineering career, and what followed was a chain of increasingly desperate, poorly executed attempts. The next year he suffered the same fate on another 8,000 meter peak, Annapurna, known as the deadliest mountain in the world. Trying to redeem himself, he went back to Everest later that same year, only to fall short again, this time at an even lower altitude around 7,700 meters. The following year, 2 more expeditions ended in failure. Then, in April 2012, after 5 straight failed attempts, he set out to climb one more 8,000 meter peak in Nepal called Shishapangma, and this is when people really began to question his credibility as a mountaineer. Nobukazu made some crucial basic mistakes on this climb, like failing to account for proper acclimatization times at base camp and even forgetting essential gear for the upper sections of the mountain. These setbacks cost him precious time, and desperate not to fail again, he made a hasty attempt at the summit in just one day, straight from base camp to the top. This wasn't just impossible, it was a reckless move. Nobukazu collapsed from exhaustion before even getting close to the summit and had to turn back. But things took a turn for the worse when he fell into a giant ice crevice. By the time the Sherpas rescued him, severe frostbite had already set in. While live streaming, some people noticed he was occasionally using fingerless gloves to handle his phone, which may have contributed to the severity of his frostbite. After this disaster, he faced serious backlash from both fans and the mountaineering community for his careless approach. But instead of stepping back, Nobukazu had one way to silence his critics. He was going to try again. He set out to summit Everest once more, choosing the West Ridge, which was a far more dangerous route than the other ones he had already failed. And now, his frostbitten fingers were useless too. However, that didn't matter to him. Everest wasn't just a mountain to him anymore, it had become his obsession. Determined to prove that he was the mountaineer he claimed to be, he brought along a large film crew and attempted another quick summit without proper acclimation. As expected, his weakened hands and sheer exhaustion stopped him at 7,500 meters. He had to descend with the help of Sherpas and was flown to a hospital where doctors confirmed his fingers were beyond saving. Amputation was his only option. Still, he refused to accept the truth and turned to home remedies, sharing disturbing pictures of his deteriorating fingers online, claiming they were improving. But of course there was no progress, and he ended up losing 9 out of the 10 fingers. It was a devastating setback. Finally, he paused to rethink his path, taking a 2-year break before making a successful return in 2014 by summiting Broad Peak. The streak of failure was finally broken, but the joy of victory didn't last long. In 2015, he went for his 5th shot at Everest and once again didn't make it. The following year, he aimed for Annapurna but came up short again. Later that same year, he went back to Everest for round 6, only to face yet another brutal setback. By 2017, his 7th failure on Everest had him becoming the butt of jokes. His fans, teammates, and even his sponsors started backing away, leaving behind the shattered dreams of a guy who once had their full support. With everything falling apart, Nobukazu grew more desperate by the day. Determined to regain the fame and respect that he had lost in his agonizing fight against the tallest peak on Earth, he decided to risk it all in 2018. This time, he set his sights on Everest's infamous southwest face, which is an almost vertical wall of ice that only a handful of expert climbers had ever conquered. Considering his repeated failures on much easier routes, it was yet another rash move, driven more by the need for public validation than sound planning. Once again, he claimed he was going to climb without supplemental oxygen or porters, but with nearly no fingers left, it was obvious the statement was more about getting attention from the audience and sponsors than any realistic strategy. The problem was, nobody really paid attention to him. Most of his fans didn't even know he was gearing up for the summit. With a tough time securing enough funding, he had to pull together a bare-bones expedition. When he finally reached the mountain, disaster struck right at the base camp. He became seriously ill and had to be rushed to the hospital. The delay chewed away precious time, and when he finally returned to Everest, the season was already slipping away. Once again, he raced against the clock and managed to establish a camp at 7,400 meters, but altitude sickness struck him again. His team alerted base camp that he was descending, yet again falling short of reaching the summit. Somewhere on the night of May 21st of 2018, battling worsening weather and severe exhaustion while descending, he slipped and fell about 100 meters down a cliff. Rescue teams tried to contact him by radio, but when he didn't respond, they launched a search. And by morning, they found his lifeless body on Everest's icy slopes. His 8th attempt to conquer the summit of Mount Everest crumbled into yet another failure, except this time he wouldn't be around to recklessly chase the peak again in the next season. As they say, keep knocking on death's door long enough and eventually it's going to answer. Nobukazu's tragic fate was a long time coming. The first successful summit of Mount Everest happened in 1953 when Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay Sherpa became the first humans to set foot on the highest point on Earth. But the dream of conquering Everest had been in motion long before that. Back in 1921, the first British expedition set its sights on the peak, kicking off a relentless series of attempts to reach the top. Over more than a century of these climbing efforts, Everest has been the stage for heartbreaking tragedies, thrilling victories, and unpredictable showdowns with nature's fiercest heights, where people are remembered for both their feats and sometimes their fates. Yet there's one crucial part of this story that doesn't nearly get enough recognition: the Sherpas. From Hillary's historic climb to today's tech-assisted expeditions, where the journey has gotten a bit less brutal, Sherpas have been the backbone of nearly every Everest ascent. These locals grow up with the mountains, developing a resistance to extreme conditions that far surpasses most seasoned climbers. In fact, many Sherpas have scaled Everest more times than the record-holding famous adventurers. Despite this, they rarely share the spotlight and resources with these influential names in the climbing community. Babu Chiri was born in a small Sherpa village of eastern Nepal in 1965. Like most locals, his father was a full-time farmer who also did high-altitude porter work on and off during the climbing season. Growing up, Babu's family didn't have many resources, and being one of 7 siblings, he understood from an early age that responsibility wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Determined to better himself, he pushed his education independently and even taught himself to speak several languages, one of them being English. That skill turned out to be a game changer. During Babu's youth, Everest expeditions from the Nepalese side were booming, drawing climbers from all over the world to Kathmandu. So, being someone who could communicate with foreigners, especially British and American mountaineers, he made his choice to become a Sherpa. As he joined more expeditions through the late 80s and 90s, Babu developed a mastery of Everest that even left the best climbers in his shadow. In his late 20s, he was already setting records that seasoned mountaineers could only dream about. From 1990 to 1999, he summited Everest a jaw-dropping 10 times. In 1995, he summited the mountain twice in just 2 weeks, becoming the first person ever to reach the peak twice in the same month. 4 years later, he pulled off one of the most daring feats in Everest history. He spent 21 hours at the summit without oxygen right inside the death zone. Climbers are always warned to never sleep at such altitudes because the body becomes dangerously vulnerable if you don't keep yourself in check. To stay awake, Babu passed the night singing Nepali folk songs over the radio. When morning came, he descended like it was just another day. Then, only a month later, he was back on the mountain for another climb. For context, these weren't just quick hiking trips. Climbers typically need weeks, sometimes months to acclimate, even at base camp, before and after pushing for the summit. But Babu, born and raised in the region, already had the altitude in his blood. A year after his 21 hours at the summit, he shattered yet another record, this time scaling Everest in just 16 hours and 56 minutes. To this day, no one has matched that speed. It was around that time when his fame exploded, and literally every major climbing expedition at Everest Base Camp wanted him as their guide. Even the King of Nepal took notice and recognized his incredible achievements. But with the kind of heights he reached, the fall that followed was more devastating than anyone could have imagined. In 2001, Babu had planned a trek from the Tibetan base camp to the Khumbu Icefall region. To put it simply, the Khumbu Icefall is one of the most treacherous regions of the routes to the Everest summit from the Nepalese side. True to its name, it's a place where glaciers shift and massive, unpredictable crevices open up without warning, pulling climbers in out of nowhere. It was in this very area that the infamous Everest earthquake in 2014 set off an avalanche, killing 16 Sherpas in one single day. Babu wanted to document this route with photos while attempting to reach the summit for his 11th time. In late April 2001, he set out with his team, including his brother. They reached Camp 2 from base camp on April 29th, and after settling in for a bit, Babu decided to get some shots of the mountain view a little further from their camp. Around 4 p.m., he left alone, telling the rest of the group to wait for him at dinner. The daylight was fading, and Khumbu wasn't a place to be after dark due to the unpredictable terrain. His brother urged him not to go too far, but Babu, confident in his skills, didn't listen. His brother watched as Babu disappeared from sight, and that was the last time anyone saw him alive. Hours passed, and as night fell, intense fog began to roll in over the mountain. Babu's friends and his brother kept waiting for him at dinner, but he never showed up. By around 9 p.m., it was clear something was wrong. Babu's brother called for a search, and he and other climbers scoured the area with flashlights, but there was no sign of him. Then, around midnight, another expedition leader spotted footprints leading to a hidden crevice. He followed them into the snow split, and there he was. Babu had fallen in. Somewhere along the way, while trying to capture the perfect shot, he had lost his footing, falling into the 10-meter deep crevice. He was gone instantly. The next morning, after 3 hours of intense effort, they finally managed to recover his body. Babu's death quickly made headlines around the world in the mountaineering community, and the King of Nepal sent a message of condolences to his family